This is our third concrete input regarding the topic itself. And let me welcome Professor Heribert HINZEN as a senior consultant of UNESCO Institute for Lifelong Learning, but also former director of DVV International, a Bonn headquartered organization to support adult and lifelong learning worldwide. Also, Professor HINZEN is a distinguished colleague and professor. He's also, in this regard, a great scholar in adult learning and education, and an honorary professor in several universities, like in Pécs in Hungary, Yash, and some other very honored universities in Southeast Europe. So thank you very much for accepting our invitation, Heribert. And let me just greet all other participants of today's event. May I just greet Professor Tuckett. Hi, Alan, and very welcome to the program. Let me welcome all other colleagues and presenters of yesterday, Dorothy Schulte and Mpine Makwe. Also, let me greet Katarina Popovic from Belgrade, Secretary General of International Council for Adult Education. Hello. And all other distinguished members. Very welcome to each and all of you. And I just would like to call your attention that the topic that we are trying to elaborate upon, and your comments and questions are very welcome at the chat part of this platform. I think this issue is a very important matter regarding adult and lifelong learning, and what universities may be able to recognize as an important mission as part of their responsibility and action towards their own communities. And I think UCAN has provided several project-based examples of how it has aimed at for several decades, making universities to change from lifelong learning universities to university lifelong learning, to be proactive and to resonate changes and more attention to be given towards the public. So Heribert, very welcome to the program, and let me give you the floor. Before doing this, let me ask our members of this session to go to your picture, to your photo here, and at the top right corner, at the three dots, you can rename yourself, and just please indicate your first name, your city, and your country where you're coming from, and it will be a little bit easier for others to recognize your background. Thank you for this indeed, and I would like to give the floor to Professor HINZEN, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Balázs. I actually enjoyed the session so far, which started on Monday. So I've chosen a topic which actually leans on, and there we can go to the next slide, which leans on the idea that one of the most important parts of our lifelong learning is everything related to adults, because it is the largest group of society globally, and it is the longest part of life. So therefore, when we now have this enlarged debate on education as a human right, now moving into human right to lifelong learning, then of course it is my understanding that adult education and lifelong learning, and the university lifelong learning within the whole paradigm of lifelong learning, is of highest importance. Next. So I appreciated the session yesterday, which looked into what the universities are doing with all in the futures of education discussion. And at the same time, I enjoyed very much the Monday's opening session with Professor Sir Alan Tuckett. And he was presenting actually some 10 commandments, some ideas how the universities could engage better in the future. And two of his points was that work with agencies which are already involved or engaged, and to work with partners having common concerns, was something which I thought that I would do a follow-up in my presentation today. So the agencies already engaged and the partners' common concerns, I actually choose three of them. The Volkshochschulen in Germany, the folk high schools, then their international wing, which we may call DVV International, and where I worked for the last 40 decades, and the cooperation, especially on the global level, with UNESCO. Next. Those who were present in the presentation with Alan on Monday, he started looking at the historical roots of adult education, and it was interesting how related it actually to two major developments. One, of course, was the Enlightenment, which today is very, very close to what we have on the European level as citizenship education. But at the same time, he was looking at the area of the agricultural and industrial revolution, which on the other hand today is very close related to what we have as vocational skills and employability. So could you animate to have the picture? So at that time, it was the working class in our society, and here is the German slogan which they were using, and that is knowledge is power. And later we shall come back to that because it's even a phrase today which we are using. And the second, you have the face of Grundtvig, which somehow we may call as the father of the folk high schools, but somehow very, very close to what we today call as popular or general or enlightening adult education. So I think these as historical roots are important, not only to understand the situation globally, but I would specifically relate it now to Germany and the development of the folk high schools. Next. So when we look globally, we have all kinds of names looking at institutions which are working in adult learning and education. We have the adult education centers. In Asia, very often we have the community learning centers. In the Nordic countries, all kinds and sorts of the folk high schools. We have in many parts of the world the so-called cultural houses. We have the developments in study circles, and we have the university community engagement, which is very, very close to what we had 100 years ago as the departments of the extramural studies, which were there at the universities. Next. So this reality of adult education globally is a high diversity. And what I just did here is, it's a brief animated slide where you see only for the members of the European Association for the Education of Adults, with all their different logos and the more than 100 members, they are all involved in community-based adult learning and education. And they are all, and we will see that later, they are all very, very close to what we call as active and global citizenship education. And my idea is that we should look from the university lifelong learning perspective, how to engage with those partners which we have on the community level in all countries in the development of better active citizenship. The next. relating it back to Germany, I think the most important step was that the constitution of the first democracy in Germany, before we had an emperor system. So in 1919, in the constitution of the Weimarer Republic, for the first time, we had a clause which stated adult education, including the folk high schools, should be supported at national, provincial, and local level. And I think making adult learning and education a constitutional matter explains much of what we have as the reality and the situation of adult education in Germany today. Next. So if we look at a few dates, in 1919, the big beginning of the folk high school movement, a national association as DVV was created in 1953. In 1969, all the international efforts were institutionalized as DVV International. And that relates, of course, so that in 2019, we celebrated the 100 years of the folk high schools. And those who have a little bit of time and want to understand how this is celebrated, then please have a look at the video of the folk high school in Essen, which was one of the oldest ones, who celebrated this event in the largest cinema in Germany from that time, which celebrated 100 years of the Lichtburg cinema also. At the same time, you see, 1969, last year, we celebrated 50 years of DVV International also. I'll come back to that later. Next. So the celebration of the 100 years took place in the St. Paul's Cathedral in Frankfurt. And as you may imagine, the keynote was delivered by the President of the Federal Constitutional High Court, and he related the folk high school's start of 1919 and the then constitution with the new constitution of 1949, when the Second World War was over and the new form of democracy in Germany started again. Next. So a special example for the celebrations in Germany were actually in Hamburg, because the foundational document of the University of Hamburg and of the folk high school in Hamburg are in the same founding document 100 years ago. And you may imagine that the celebrations of the university and the folk high school in Hamburg was a great event for the city. Next. The other 1,000 folk high schools in Germany had actually a one-year-long celebrations, which was associated with a big marketing campaign. And you see 3 of the animated persons in there, which you come back later. And you see the slogan below, that is 100 years of sharing wisdom, which is very, very close to what the working class was using 100 years ago, calling it knowledge is power, Wissen ist Macht. So today it was sharing knowledge. Next one. So the faces, and I think you recognize the analog to the digital and from the Society to Health with Karl Marx. So I think these were some of the posters which were used in the marketing campaign to remind people on the importance of the folk high schools. And in a research at the end of the year, it was found out that actually almost 80% of the total German society knows the logo of VHS, the folk high schools. So the creating of a better knowledge, information, and even image was a very successful step in that campaign of the 100 years of folk high schools. Next. And if you look at the reality of that system now 100 years later, after it became a constitutional matter, you have those 900 centers with sub-centers actually in each village and each city in Germany, with more than 6 million participants in courses and more than 3 million in lectures. And next, so that when you look, next please, that when you look at a slide, how is the distribution in respect to ages, then you can see that it's actually the whole participation of society throughout all ages. But the most important part for our discussion today is that 20% of this 9 million participants come for courses and lectures in respect to politics, society, the environment. So we may call it the largest institution in respect to creating active citizenship, or as institution which is a potential strong partner for the university lifelong learning in creating a better understanding of active citizenship in the country which you are working. So that is a reality next, which we have in Germany. And if you look, coming back to what Alan was claiming on Monday, that we should try to work with agencies and partners who are already involved, then there is a federal agency for civic education in Germany, the Bundeszentrale für politische Bildung, which has as the major aims strengthening of democracy and fostering civil society. And if you are deeply interested, you may move to their website. And for the cooperation, the president of this federal agency is a member of the DVV Advisory Board. And a second very important institution for the cooperation is the German Association for University Continuing and Distance Education, which I assume is a member of UCEN. And that was founded in 1970 as a cooperation between the local centers for high schools and universities in their field of academic adult education. And today, the DVV is a member of the advisory board of that association. So we are trying to channel our efforts of cooperation with partners through this diversity of working with partners in the country. Next. I'm moving now from the German scenery to the international or the global one. And let me briefly inform that DVV International, as the International Institute of the German Adult Education Association, DVV, is, as I mentioned earlier, in its existence since 1969 and is now actually working with more than 200 partners globally and has a number of interesting projects which they are doing with partners individually and at the same time cooperating with partners which are involved in that area globally, like the International Council for Adult Education or the UNESCO Institute for Lifelong Learning. Next. And as part of this cooperation, DVV International has been publishing extensively findings from global cooperation on community learning centers or in adult education centers, and you see all the linkages because all the publications are available online, so you can have access to them. And the latest one in the series of the International Perspectives in Adult Education is a contribution of adult education to active participatory citizenship, which is an outcome of a very interesting European Union funded project, which was called EduMap. So if you're interested, link into the DVV International website, you will find those and many, many more interesting publications related to the discussion which we are having here. Next. Oh, that is a little bit difficult with the PDF. You will not see the full name, but it is the city of Vitebsk in Belarus, which is one of the partner cities of DVV International, where the DVV International office continues working in Belarus, even in these very, very difficult times. And I've just been involved in an evaluation together with Imacon in these areas of the meso level of activities in institutionalizing and professionalizing adult education. But this city of Vitebsk is now a member of the UNESCO Global Network of Learning Cities, and you will recall that yesterday and even especially on the Monday, Alan was discussing that the Learning Cities approach is a very, very interesting instrument on community level together with universities and adult education centers and the city council to get involved in active citizenship. Next. We had also yesterday a discussion on the currently running Futures of Education UNESCO report, and we shortly mentioned the Delors Treasure Within from 1995, the 72 by Fora on Learning to Be. But I mentioned yesterday that the ICAE contribution to the Futures of Education is available on the ICAE website. And I think it's for the second time now. In '94, ICAE contributed also to the Delors report, that there is now an interesting state-of-the-art discussion by ICAE on where we see that adult education should be moving in the future together with all the other areas of the futures of education. Next one. I want to relate it now a little bit into the context of the UNESCO International Conference Series. And we all know that there is a conference series for the higher education. We have a conference series for the skills area. And interestingly, the latest UNESCO World Conference on skills for work and life had this lifelong learning dimension already. And if you look at the latest publications coming out of ILO, and I invite you to access their website, you'll see a very interesting debate on the entitlement of lifelong learning and what it means if we are moving to lifelong learning as a human right. And there's a very interesting review what it actually means. If lifelong learning becomes a human right, then this is also important for the 2 billion people who are working in the informal sector globally. And they usually are not within the reach of educational governance, which are always related to the formal education sector. But this time, at this moment, let me look at the international conferences in adult education. The abbreviation comes from a French wording. It's Confintea. The first one was in '49, the same year when UNESCO was founded. That was in Helsingør. 2009, it was in Belém in Brazil. And the next one is in '22 in Marrakesh, coming up. So in Belém, we achieved in having a framework for action, the Belém framework for action, and that covers 5 areas on policy, governance, financing, participation, and quality. Next. And it was important that we got an understanding that in the Belém framework, adult education and learning is a significant component of lifelong learning, which has all the continuum from the formal to the non-formal and the informal, as we mentioned yesterday also. And there is a clause, very important for us as lobbyists for adult education, that multipurpose community learning centers and spaces, so such like the folk high schools or the adult education centers, should be supported by governments. And we know that Confintea has been endorsed by all our governments who participated in this global meeting. Next. The UNESCO Institute for Lifelong Learning is doing a regular monitoring of this process. They call it the Global Report on Adult Learning and Education. We put it into the BELAM framework in 2009, and already 4 have been published in the meantime. And the next one is just on the way, and that has the topic of our discussion here, which is on active and global citizenship education. And all the questionnaires from all the 190 member countries have gone out through the UNESCO National Commissions. The reports are now evaluated and the figures taken, and this RALE number 5 will be published alongside the Marrakesh 2022 Global Conference. Next. There was another very important process. We had the first World Education Forum in 1990. The next in 2000, we had it in Dakar, and the latest one was the World Education Forum in Incheon, Korea, 2015. And it was quite clear that all the results from the World Education Forum would move into the Sustainable Development Goals as goal number 4 for education. Next. So when we discussed in the World Education Forum the global perspective to 2030, we phrased to ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all. And the UN General Secretary, only a few months later, took the whole set of recommendations into the 17 Sustainable Development Goals reaching into 2030. Next. All in all, this global goal for the SDG 4 Education 2030 has 2 which are even mentioning the area which we are discussing today. The 4.3, you can see, that is the whole through an institutional lens, looking at the education from the early till the university level. So for the first time, it was not included in the 2000 World Education Forum. The universities were not mentioned. This time, yes, the universities are there. And under 4.7, we have that global citizenship is an important aim, and actually this has to be ensured, and looking at the overall goal, promoted through lifelong learning activities. Next. On the means of implementation, again, the community learning centers and spaces, but this time in a blended understanding with the IT developments, will be seen as essential elements in the lifelong learning process. So the institutionalization as part of looking at lifelong learning, in addition to the biographical lens, looking from early childhood to the elderly, I think that was the big success of the Sustainable Development Goals and the Education 2030. But if you read the document which we produced on behalf of ICAE to the Futures of Education, we at the same time discussed that we were not in a position to strengthen adult learning and education as a system, as a subsector of education, and not as an academic discipline, which I think we should try already in the next Confintea 7 as an aim, which is important then for the further implementation of the SDGs. Next. So when you look at the 17 goals, then I mentioned the quality education, but at the same time we always argued that all the other 16 goals cannot be implemented with an enlightened citizenry, so that active citizenship education is important to implement all what is needed for all the other 16 goals. Next. Following the process of Confintea and the SDG, in 2015, the UNESCO General Conference then declared and adopted a recommendation on adult learning and education, which again, and that's why I want to mention it, was adopted by all our governments. And I think it's now our right and our duty to hold our governments accountable that these recommendations, and I think it's interesting to look at them also, you find it easily on the UNESCO Institute website, what our governments has endorsed and adopted. Definitely the community learning centers are there. Next. So what I've done, and I think that's the last slide, the 40 years which I've been involved in that adult education and lifelong learning in civil society and university, I try to look at it in some perspectives from a biographical lens. If you want to read more about it, we did a working paper at the University of Glasgow, then you would like to see a little bit more. And I think the final slide is just saying a thank you for inviting me. And at the same time, I put my personal Sisyphus as an image, which I think is that we have to continue trying our best. Although we all know that the world, and we have seen that a bit dramatically in the recent year, is not getting easier or better in many respects. So thank you so much, and I'm happy to stay on and share into the discussion on issues which you may want to raise additionally. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Heribert. I think it was an interesting approach and narrative regarding international commitments and practical examples through community learning centers, and also to have an overview of advancements of international adult learning and education collaborative work to integrate community-based activities, especially in the grounds of participatory developments. And I just would like to make you to comment first of all to the issue. What would you see as an interesting call? And UNESCO was talking about education for all around the millennium, and 15 years later there was another slogan to highlight the inclusion of communities and citizens through the term "no one left behind." And I think these things are just reminding us about your Sisyphus focus, that this is still a huge challenge to deal with vulnerable groups in different parts of the world. What do you see, Heribert, as a major concern by having participated with this actual document to be provided into the as an input to the future of education work. What do you see as a major challenge for higher education, but also for the educational community to improve either participation or both performance levels to be raised through lifelong learning?
Let me start with the discussion which we had in the year 2000, and you related it rightly at the World Education Forum in 2000, and I remember the heated debates which we had at the time, that there was a phrase which then came out as education for all. And we all know that education is a limited perspective, and I'm happy that we have now, especially for adult education, have a phrase which we call adult learning and education. So that's a much wider approach. At the same time, what we did not achieve after education for all in 2000, and rightly you associated it with the Millennium Development Goals, when at the UN General Assembly in the same year 2000, the phrasing of the Millennium Development Goals was taken, then from the whole education for all, it was only universal primary education which got in. So there was nothing outside that process being supported by the United Nations. And that, of course, when later we were looking at discussions with our own governments, you could never relate to it, because the UN went only into primary education. They didn't mention anything in respect to the universities, nothing in respect to adult education. So it was a very limited education for all. And with that background, I think we moved into the debates, because we realized then already in 2010, 11, 12, that this perspective on related it only to the primary schooling level could never achieve what we were emerging to, a paradigm shift towards lifelong learning. So it was in intention, and it was really an important step at the time, that with all the other global conferences, and it was not only the Confintea, as I said, for adult education, but it was the global conferences for the universities and the global university and the global conferences for the vocational education sector, you know, that this lifelong learning perspective was winning ground and included much stronger than before the sectors of the universities and the adult education, and how we can combine it today within the perspective of the university lifelong learning. So I think that was a very valuable, a very important, and how now to move from this level of policy on into make it a reality, I think that's something which needs much more efforts. And if I speak briefly in respect to adult education again, then I think you saw why I highlighted so strongly that becoming a constitutional matter is so important, because then it becomes a right, and it's no longer a policy on paper, but it is related as a policy to legislation and to financing. And this golden triangle has to go together, otherwise it will never work. And I think it's for the universities the same, especially for the public funded university. If they are not part of legislation and not part of a financing in addition to policy, it will not work. And I think that is the process which we globally have not yet achieved. And that's why I said I'm so happy to see the latest report by ILO, where they even take it serious to leave no one behind, that they look at the 2 billion people living in the informal sector globally, and they are excluded. They don't go to primary school, they don't go to secondary, they don't go to kindergarten, they go to vocational, they don't go to university, they don't go to adult education. They are outside, but creating that entitlement is an obligation by the state to look into it. And I think this is our job then, our advocacy work, to do and provide the necessary follow-up. Balázs, your micro is closed. Balázs.
There are some questions, sorry, that we would like you to shortly respond to. Jenny Page from Ioannina, Greece, is asking how universities will recognize prior experienced learning, and what do you think that the Center for Lifelong Learning in University will play an important role to this process?
Well, I may not be the right person to answer that, but if I make a claim, I hope the university will get involved in all the heated debate. If I look at it from the European level, in all the heated debate which we have on the European qualifications framework. And it is a hot struggle to continue to get all the qualifications as prior learning, which we have in all fields of education in, and to have the universities involved. Because you are claiming who has the right to enter university, and if there is not an acknowledgement of that, what has been learned outside the formal school system, which in Germany is related to the Abitur or any other O-level or baccalaureate or whatever, then I think we fail in the long run, and there is no chance for people beyond the formal sector to move in. So then the claim that there is some equality in usefulness and rights between the formal, the non-formal, and the informal, I think it will never work. So I fully agree that the universities should get involved, but how they should do it administratively and how much they're already involved, I'm sorry. Maybe there are other people in the room who have a better knowledge of that.
Thank you, Heribert, and thank you for the question, Jenny. There's another question from Dorothee Schulte in Berlin, representing Fernuniversität Hagen. What is your experience of willingness to work together? For example, in Germany, there is a great interest in differentiation between university lifelong learning, adult learning education, and professional continuing education. I guess it is not so much appreciated to collaborate. What do you think?
Well, I recall the debate when we had all the discussion on universities moving deeper into lifelong learning, or the heated debate in Germany where there is less cooperation but much more competition. And the universities are using their much better facilities for all kinds of further education, and they are taking room of the local adult education centers. So I think the point which you raise, that there is not so much interest, it's even beyond. It's a discussion on competition. And I think the best movement, well, it's unfortunately a little bit long ago, was 15 years ago when we had a concerted committee where all institutions on the level of education were invited, and it was a bit of a follow-up when we had this debate coming actually from the European level, that we had the Memorandum of Lifelong Learning, and all members of the European Union were invited to create their own strategies for lifelong learning. And in that process, we developed in Germany this lifelong learning strategy, and there was a high-level commission at that time who developed the strategy of financing lifelong learning. And I think that would have been the correct place where all those institutions should continue working together, because I have a feeling if they don't do it, then it is the potential participants, the people, who will suffer. And as I claimed yesterday already, I think it's especially the other sectors which are suffering most in the COVID period, because the universities could adapt much better to all sorts of digital work in the university than the early childhood could do, or the schools, or the vocational, or the adult education. And if I look at the heated debate currently in Germany again, that they're thinking about another close down of the schooling or the kitas or the adult education, then I think acting together would have been of highest importance even in this COVID period. Otherwise, if you are separated, then they do what they like as government, and I think it's again the participants, the pupils, the students, and the adult students in university lifelong learning or in the local centers who are suffering.
Thank you very much for this critical reflection. Katarina Popovic has just indicated in her comment to the chat that ICAE prepared the background report for grade 5 on citizenship education, global citizenship education, comparative study with the examples from different world regions and background theoretical analysis. Still not accessible, we have to wait for ULL, but we will alert adult learning community when ULL upload the document itself. And Alan has a question. How do we close the gap between government commitments and at international events and their follow through with finance and local practice?
Actually, Alan, I should ask you. You did this excellently for a long period with NIAS and all the Learners Weeks, and when you were close to your Minister for Lifelong Learning and all these things, I think we should invite you again to let us know. But I think it's a very difficult struggle, and of course it's always the competition in financing between the different subsectors of education. There's a competition between the social service sectors of health and education and others. But I think the continuation and to use that international documentation in our advocacy work, I think is a must. And I can only let you know that I, on that level, try to continue to do it. And I had stronger consultancies this year in countries like Armenia. We did a review of global AID for the financing on popular adult education through public finances. So it's a continuation of a struggle which you will never win, but maybe it is something which ICAE will have to look into, how to find more and better methods for adapting to the new brave world in using methods which are more appropriate. But Alan, can I invite you to let us know a bit from your vast experience?
Well, I mean, the first thing I wanted to say was I thought in your presentation, you might have said there'd hardly be an international association of national bodies for adult education without the work of DVVI, that's a very practical way of supporting active citizenship in other countries, and it, you know, the whole world movement's reliant on DVV's role in that, I think. I mean, Katarina may talk about this tomorrow, but the SDGs, great, and we're in there as promoting lifelong learning. And then the body created by the same governments to secure the financing of it, the Global Partnership for Education, when asked about adult literacy, which is the spectacular failure of the earlier Education for All, said, there's no money for that. If you want adult education like that, you've got to go and raise the money yourselves. Now, that kind of attitude that sees us at the margin of the margins, when you can't achieve the SDGs without adults learning, remains a pretty profound problem. When I was young, I used to think that the trick was to move adult education from the margins of education policy to the center of the overall central government coordinating body, because it's a catalyst for all kinds of other activity. But it does mean sometimes you look like you're at the back of a class putting your hand up to answer every question that the teacher asks, to say, I can help with that, I can help with that. And it's true that adults can help with it, but it does make it harder for us to make a simple, clear, short, focused proposition to policymakers, I think.
Thank you for the comment. Indeed, Katarina has a question, and Katarina puts, how do you see the danger in some countries or regions where universities open the centers for lifelong learning, but they turn to be more a sort of additional funding source for universities, offering PC and language courses, competing with the traditional adult learning education providers?
Yeah, the competition is there, and it's a reality. And as the universities are better off usually with finances, or even with the staff and all the technicalities, I think that competition is there. And that competition is also there with the private sector, which gets the support from big companies or whatever. So I think when I was arguing for a better governance of the sector, I was arguing for a long-term golden triangle of the best policy, legislation and finances for adult education also. So if we would have better equipped adult education centers with all the support they need, I think they would be in a better situation for cooperation or even to stand in the competition with the universities. But if the local centers are left alone and they have to earn all their money to invest, then of course the competition is a very unfair game. Yeah, but to restrict the universities of using, I think, would be claiming against that we need all institutions globally and we need all efforts if a lifelong learning for all becomes a reality. So I would stress the point for cooperation, and I would try to live with the situation that some of it sometimes is in competition, but in the most important sector, it is the need for cooperation between all the sectors. And I may want to mention another one which has been quite instrumental, important in the German case. It's not only the cooperation with the universities, but one of the strongest instruments is the cooperation with the trade unions, which is called Arbeit und Leben, which is an association on the cooperation in respect to work and life, with a huge, and of course it's a competition with what trade unions are doing, but I think in the long run, I think it's supporting the cause of lifelong learning for all.
Thank you very much, Heribert. I think this again takes us back to the matter of interdependencies, how much we are stuck in the same systems, as like Alan just mentioned. Governments may too late recognize and admit the constraints what we may face when there is a lack of vision or lack of policy or lack of instruments in legal or financial terms, and no bridging them at all, really. That I think this is something very much interesting to be continued. May I ask if there is any reflection from this? Katarina just indicated, yes, it is the reality, but it's also the consequence of the position that universities are put in, losing resources, being forced to seek support from the companies, especially humanities are in bad position. I think this is also there. But also you can find this aspects on the side of different disciplinary areas or faculties having high representation or underrepresentation in particular calls and programs international, like in the world of EU. Lucilia Santos made the comment, it is also collides with policy when in your country, lifelong learning, continuous education is automatically seen as a bourgeoisie thing and adult education is obviously a people thing. By people, I mean proletariat. And there is also a question from Jorge Miguel, and Carmen just reminded me not to forget about this. And yes, indeed, I would like to get back to the question. I honestly would like to give the floor to Jorge. Can you please turn on your mic, because I just don't find your question to have been put into the chat part. The floor is yours.
Yeah, sure. So my question goes about the different approaches, and sometimes there are about policies for citizenship. Like sometimes they focus in active citizenship, but there are also some changes that, for example, today we are talking about active citizenship and also global citizenship, and there are also other terms connected like responsible citizenship, critical. So based on your experience, do you think that, have you seen some changes, like sometimes different approaches over the years, that there has to be some changes in the policies regarding that? And do you think sometimes they can collide? Like sometimes there may be a focus in, for example, responsible citizenship, and this can collide with active citizenship, for example.
Of course, we have seen terms coming and going, and we have seen methods being used in the area of citizenship education coming and going. And in this time, let's call it of digitalization, we see methods coming and going. But I think I've always believed in a mixture. So if you, from your perspective, would be using, combining everything, having a participatory, active and global citizenship education, I won't mind. I think for me, again, it's more the inclusive perspective to have everybody involved, yeah, than now to look at with some rigid understanding, yeah, in respect to the terms, and then others are excluded as not being that important. So I think the terms may continue to change, but in the area of our adult education, I think the move into getting it as adult learning education has broadened the perspective, yeah, and this is, I think, is important.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Jorge, for the question. Thank you, Heribert, for his response, and thank you very much to each and all of you who have participated in this today's event to have an insight to these issues of international commitments and practical examples around citizenship, global citizenship education. Thank you very much, Professor Hinzen, to share with us your focus and narrative, and thank you very much for UCAN colleagues to organize the session itself. We also have 2 other days the rest of the week, but meaningfully we have presentations from Katarina Popovic from Belgrade tomorrow. And if I may have the slide, can you, Carmen, please help me with showing the week program and share it with us? I think it's interesting to have an overview. This is it. So tomorrow we are having presentation from Katarina and Popovic and Maja Maksimovic to focus on students and community engagement in civic education, an interesting case to be visited. And then on Friday, we invite all the presenters to come back together with the participants of the week to come to a panel discussion to discuss rethinking lifelong learning in the scope of active and global citizenship for the next decade. So let me thank you for your participation for today. I thank you, Heribert, for your presentation. And thank you for the questions and comments to this topic of today. And I wish you every good, stay in good health, take good care, and let us meet tomorrow and on Friday. Thank you so much indeed.
Thank you, Balázs. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thanks, Heribert.
Thank you for all your support in Barcelona.
Thank you, Carmen. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Bye. Thank you. Bye.